All right, hey everybody. So this is a quick presentation. I'm going to cover this idea of threading events through world history from the beginning to the end. And the primary reason I'm doing this is because I know a lot of kids in 2020, the coronavirus kids, are probably wondering, why do we need to learn the rest of this 20th century stuff? And I kind of get it. Like, they're this special group of kids who got to take AP World History Modern as the very first group, meaning they could pretty much ignore everything from 1200 and before. And then, because of coronavirus, now for the AP exam, they can ignore everything after 1900. But is there value? Yes, I actually think there is some value. So let me explain this idea of threading, and we're going to connect the 20th century to something that will be usable on the DBQ. Okay, so if we're not going to be assessed over this, why should we learn it? Because you can use this stuff on the DBQ in a very specific situation. To earn the contextualization point on the DBQ, students may relate the topic of the prompt to broader historical events, developments, or processes that continue after the time frame of the question. So that means things from the 20th century can help you with contextualization if you use them to sort of frame the evidence or the topic of the prompt. You could say, this process or development continued into the 20th century, and that can earn you contextualization. We looked at this earlier in the year in a sample where a kid tried to talk about pizza and the Columbian Exchange, but they didn't do a good enough job. However, the College Board still considered that to be an attempt at contextualization. Okay, so events, developments, and processes. We throw these around a lot, so let's just talk about what they are real quick, and then we'll look at how to put this stuff together. Okay, so an event, this is a single occurrence. This is World War I. This is the fall of Constantinople, whatever. A development. This is something that is distinct and new during a time period. So when we see our first really consolidated political states in Europe, that was a political development. When we saw the connection of Mexico to the Philippines, linking the Americas to Asia, that development was the first global trade system. All right, and then a process, that is a multi-step method that creates something. Okay, so there's a bread baking process. There is the state building process, whereby some guy probably starts out with a few dudes with swords, and he winds up being the ruler of a large, diverse empire. Okay, that's a process, because you don't just snap your fingers unless you're that wannabe Thomas Malthus guy. Yeah. Okay, so threading. We have 4 distinct time periods in this course, but some processes especially span across those time periods. Okay, there are things that we can see in the period 1200 to 1450, and when we look at 1900 to 2000, it's just a continuation of that process. It is developed. Events have changed it in some way, shape, or form, but it's essentially the same process. I think this is incredibly important when you're reviewing for the course, because it gives you that sort of big picture understanding that is going to allow you to better contextualize something. Because not only can contextualization discuss how the prompt continues into the future, but obviously it also relates to developments, processes, and events that occurred before the time period of the prompt, or are occurring simultaneously during the time period of the prompt. And so for the DBQ, this is how we're going to kind of contextualize or contextualization proof ourselves, is by looking at these threads and being able to figure out where the prompt falls along one of these threads, which gives us tons of options for contextualization. Okay, so for this, because the topic of this is connecting the 20th century, we're going to look at how we can connect some of this 20th century, a couple 20th century topics, all the way back to Unit 1. Okay, and that way it hopefully provides you a little bit of motivation to pay attention to this stuff, or hang on to it and for kids that aren't taking this in 2020, this is just going to be how we sort of set up review. All right, so let's start with College Board Topic 7.2, which is to explain the causes and consequences of World War I. So if we take the most immediate link, we can look at 6.1, which is cultural, religious, racial ideologies such as nationalism were used to justify imperialism. And we know that two of the main reasons for World War I were imperialism and nationalism. We got 6.2, state expansion allowed some countries to get more powerful, but other newer countries like Germany did not. If we go back then to Unit 5, we know that the Industrial Revolution and its spread allowed European states that participated in World War I to create very efficient killing machine armies with more effective killing technology. So the industrial processes not only gave you better weapons, but an ability to mass produce them. 5.2, nationalism and revolutions led to new states and shifting imperialism. And this, of course, contributes to 6.1 and 6.2, and it directly gives us the unification of states like Germany and Italy. So that's the immediate period before 1900s. That's the modern era. Can we go back to the early modern era? Yes. 4.5, maritime empires use mercantilist policies to compete against each other globally. And again, that competition in Europe is going to lead us to this, conflict in World War I. 4.4, maritime empires were established, driven by competition and rivalries between European states. And if you know anything about a good rivalry, it never ends. It may just sleep for a little while the other team sucks, but as soon as they're decent at all, we go back to hating them again. Rivalries. 4.1 and 4.2, technological innovations. In this case, they fuel exploration and transoceanic travel, but of course, technological innovation in the 20th century is going to lead to militarism, which is going to lead to World War I. And if we want to go all the way back and be a little bit tacky as well, let's look at Unit 2. The Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean Basin, and the Trans-Saharan trade routes largely excluded European states. And so they were like the kids outside of the playpen. And if you've ever been in that situation, you know that all you want in life is to get into the game and play. And then once you do, you're going to take it out on everyone that left you out. So if we go all the way back to Unit 2, we see how European states were kind of left out of the greater world trade, which is maybe going to help explain why they do some of the things they do in Units 4 and 5. And then if we go way, 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 way back to Unit 1, we get 1.6, where Europe is politically fragmented after the fall of the Roman Empire. So this series of decentralized states, which are largely ineffective and bad at governing or really doing anything useful, that is going to build groups like Germany and France and England and Spain and Italy, which is going to lead us into that rivalry in period 4, which is going to lead us into competition during the modern era, which is going to lead us to World War I. So this thread of events linking Europe to empire and really this is a kind of a political process with some economic mixed in. It does go all the way from Unit 7 all the way back to Unit 1. So that's going from 7 and going backwards. Let's look at something from Unit 9. Explain the continuities and change in the global economy from 1900 to the present. So this is 9.4. This is a globalization in the economy objective. And so let's start from the very beginnings. 1.1, the economy of Song China. It was highly commercialized and it relied on innovations in manufacturing. Manufacturing in China. Is that a continuity in the global economy from 1900 to the present? Well, I mean, if you look at it going back to 1200, yeah, it kind of comes back, right? Because as we joke these days in the 21st century, like almost everything is manufactured in China. And that's the way it was back in 1200 when we started the course. 1.2, Muslim states encourage intellectual innovations and transfers. The transfer of innovations and technology is part of the global economy from 1900 to the present. 2.1, 2.3, 2.4, we have our first sort of intercontinental trade routes. These are going to be the basis for global trade moving forward. 2.2, the expansion of empires helped to facilitate trade, and we know that political states like the U.S., like China, are constantly looking for opportunities to grow their trade base in the world today. Opportunities in Africa or elsewhere in Asia, but states drive trade in the 20th century. 2.5 and 2.6, the cultural and environmental consequences. Now, these are going to be covered elsewhere in Unit 9, but without a doubt, they are linked to this economic trade. 3.2, the use of tribute and tax systems to build states. During period 3, we talk about places like Srivijaya or East African city-states growing because they could tax trade routes. Well, what do political states do these days? At least in 2020, the United States is trying to trade or tax trade again so that we can make more money for the federal government. 4.1, technological innovations made transoceanic trade possible, and we know that technological innovations like containerization, global cellular networks, satellite GPS systems and stuff make global trade possible in the world today. 4.2, the construction of trading post empires. Again, strong similarities to the sort of economic imperialism we're going to see later. Spoilers. The Columbian Exchange, which had massive effects on societies that came into contact with it, some good, some bad. When we talk continuities and change in the global economy from 1900 to the present, we are going to talk positives and negatives as well. Expansion of maritime trading networks and mercantilism, the effect of diversity on social hierarchies. Does diversity affect countries in the world today? Yes. The Industrial Revolution, capitalism, free markets, imperialism, export economies, economic imperialism, all aspects of the world today. Well, maybe not empires, maybe. Migration in an interconnected world, it's going to start in Unit 6. And so there we go. We go all the way from 1.1 up to through Unit 6, and then we land in the 20th century. And if we looked in Unit 7 and 8, of course, we'd probably find connections as well. Okay, so, all right, Mr. Hudson, you've sold me. I'm going to learn this 20th century stuff. Great. I'm going to be able to use it for evidence beyond the docs, right? No. While in 2020, there are 2 points for evidence beyond the documents. We're going to talk about some strategies for that. Using information from the 20th century is not going to help you on that part of the rubric. It is going to be contextualization only because your evidence has to be period specific and relevant to the question to support your argument. If you're being asked about state building processes from 1750 to 1900 and you bring up Nazis, because Nazis, well, that's great. It would be an example of maybe state building processes continuing beyond the time of the prompt. That's contextualization. To prove your argument about state building from 1750 to 1900, you got to have evidence of events that occurred between 1750 and 1900. Okay, so things beyond the time period, we're going to call this sort of little c contextualization that you might use in the body of your essay. This isn't your big C contextualization that you're going to start your essay with, but these are things that might support that or back up your contextualization later on, just to make sure you get that point. So I hope this gives you a little bit of an idea of why it's useful to finish out this 20th century stuff strong. And when we get to review, we're going to talk about how we are going to use this idea of threading to get us set up for the DBQ in 2020. And of course, we can also use this on the LEQ when that comes back to the AP exam as well. If you have any questions, comment, shoot me an email. Just know that we're going to come back to this idea during AP exam review. and use it to try to put ourselves in the best position possible to write these essays.